Good evening, everyone. Saludos y bienvenidos a nuestro evento de esta noche que se llama Medicina, Lenguaje y el Cuerpo, una lectura con Cristina Rivera Garza. Greetings to our audience and welcome to the third event of Innervations, Humanistic Medicine and Stories from the TMC, the Texas Medical Center. Our event tonight is called Medicine, Language, and the Body, a reading with MacArthur Genius Grant winner, Cristina Rivera Garza. The reading will take place in a blend of Spanish and English and will be followed by a moderated question and answer session with my colleague, also an award-winning author, Dr. Ricardo Nuila. Please, audience members, go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post questions throughout the event. And when it comes time to take questions from the audience, I will pass those over to our speaker. My name is Kirsten Ostherr. I'm the director of the Medical Humanities program at Rice University, and I'm also chair of the English department. And I'd like to say a few words about this series and our program before we get started. The Medical Humanities program at Rice is a multidisciplinary program that we launched about 6 years ago to explore the intersections of scientific, artistic, and humanistic understandings of health and illness. Our classes bring humanities and social science-based approaches to the experiences of illness and the culture of medicine, and we engage these topics through literature, history, religious studies, art, philosophy, anthropology, and many other disciplines. We have many ongoing collaborations with colleagues in the Texas Medical Center and the broader Houston region, and I encourage you to look at our Medical Humanities program website to learn more about what we do. Just search up Medical Humanities on the Rice website and you'll find us. The series that has brought us together today, Innervations, Humanistic Medicine and Stories from the TMC, is a collaboration between folks at Rice, at Baylor College of Medicine's Narrative Medicine program based at their Center for Health Policy and Ethics, at UT Health's McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics, the University of Houston's Medicine and Society program, the Health Museum, Texas Women's University, and our friends at Imprint. We have also received generous support from Humanities Texas and the Humanities Research Center at Rice. And we would like to encourage all of you to purchase Cristina Rivera Garza's books at our beloved local independent bookstore, Brazos Books. Our first speaker in this series, which started pre-pandemic, was author and nurse Christy Watson, who read from her award-winning book, The Language of Kindness, followed by a discussion with our discussant tonight, Ricardo Nuila. We followed that event with a reading that happened online last spring by Esme Weijun Wang, followed by a discussion with my colleague, Lacey Johnson. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Ricardo Nuila, who will in turn introduce our speaker. Ricardo Nuila is a writer, teacher, and practicing doctor. He's an associate professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy at Baylor College of Medicine, where he teaches internal medicine and directs the narrative medicine program. Ricardo is a native Houstonian who has worked as an attending physician in the city's largest safety net facility, Ben Taub Hospital, for more than a decade. The son of Salvadoran immigrants, Ricardo spent summers during his childhood in Central America. His nonfiction works focusing on health disparities have been featured in Texas Monthly, the Virginia Quarterly Review, The Atlantic, The New Yorker Online, and the New England Journal of Medicine. He has also published fiction in the Best American Short Stories anthology, and his writing has been supported by McDowell, Yaddo, and the Texas Institute of Letters, and he has earned support from the American Association of Medical Colleges to research the value of the arts in medical education. His first book, The People's Hospital, Stories and Lessons from a Safety Net Healthcare System, will be published next year. I want to thank all of you for joining us and remind the audience members to please use the Q&A to post your questions for our speakers during the event. And now over to you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you all, everybody, for joining us tonight. This happens to be, as we Houstonians know, the best night of the year in Houston because the first cold front comes in. So we can all enjoy this and then enjoy the cooler air afterwards. I have the pleasure of presenting Cristina Rivera Garza. I was very excited when she agreed to come on Innervations. And after I introduce her, she'll read, and then we'll have a conversation followed by Q&A. Cristina Rivera Garza was born on the northeastern border of Mexico, and after a nomadic life spent mostly, but not only in central Mexico, also in the United States, and then she found her way to Houston, where she is a distinguished professor of Hispanic studies at the University of Houston, as well as the leader of the creative writing program in Spanish at the University of Houston. She has won many awards. She is a poet, a translator, and a critic. She's the recipient of the Roger Calwa Award and the Ana Segers Prize, and she's the only author who's won the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize twice. And she has also won a MacArthur Fellowship Genius Grant for her work. I believe that her work is seminal to medical humanities, and so I'm so glad that she's here to spend some time with us. Thank you, Cristina, for coming, and we look forward to your reading.
All right. Well, thank you, Ricardo, for the introduction. Gracias a todo el mundo por estar aquí. Es un gusto verdadero. I'm really excited about our conversation, tonight's conversation. So this is what I'm planning on doing right now. I'm going to be reading from No One Will See Me Cry, with a novel that I published in Spanish back in 1999. It was out in English in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, and the translation was in charge of Andrew Hurley. This is a work of documentary fiction rather than a historical novel, and we might want to talk about it a little bit later. Essentially, I was doing some research for my PhD in history of medicine. I read very carefully about 300 files out of 75,000 files located at the Archive of Public Health related to the General Insane Asylum La Castañeda. This is a very famous or very infamous place in the medical history of Mexico. It was inaugurated on September 1st, 1910. It was one of the main events in the celebrations, the 10th and the 100th anniversary of the Mexican independence, and it was a momentous event for sure. I read, as I was saying, many of these files because I was trying to figure out how normal men and women, how just everyday citizens in Mexico City were able to cope with the challenges of the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, which had started in 1910 and whose armed phase went all the way through the 1920s. So I wanted to know essentially what had changed, from the Porfirian regime to the new revolutionary era. And I wanted to know how people coped with that. It is, as you may imagine, difficult to find letters and diaries and poems or books written by people who don't know how to read and write, or left behind by the poor in society, the popular groups. So I had to resort to a range of archives, and the Archive of Public Health was just at that point in time when I was doing my research, was letting researchers read this bundle of papers. And so that's what I did. On the first day that I was doing this, I came across the file of Matilda Burgos, who, this is a fake name. This is the name. She became the main character of this novel. This was a thick file containing a very detailed description of her stay at the hospital. And in addition to that, it also included several very long letters, diary entries that she was able to write. So I had access to her voice directly. And that was very unusual and such a huge privilege. It is a fact that essentially came to change my life. Look at me right now, all these many years later, still talking about her, and in many ways talking with her too. I invented a new character, Joaquin Buitrago, is a male photographer of this insane asylum. And I created a story between them, a love story, a story about growing old in Mexico City, in a rapidly changing place. And in several chapters of the book, I'm trying to explore their lives in this city. I'm very concerned about the context, about different neighborhoods and sections of a city that I still love very much. But in the third chapter, I plunged into the everyday life of the insane asylum. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today, because the topic is mostly the medical humanities. And I think this might shed some light about how doctors and inmates, as they were called back then, how they interacted with each other, what kind of ideas were they exchanging, what kind of behaviors were they also observing. That's a chapter called Everything is Language. And so this is my invitation for all of us to open the doors of the insane asylum and have a sense of what was life like inside. This begins with an epigraph by Nathaniel Lee. They call me mad, and I call them mad, and damn them, they outvoted me. Inside, commotion in the hallways, smell of cigarettes, screams and cries of desolation. Eduardo Oligochea puts a bookmark between the pages of his book before leaving the infirmary. The voices are coming from Imelda Salazar's cell. What are they saying? The world is coming to an end. The plates are piled high with pride. Her eyes, like the wool shawl that she covers her head with, are black. She's down on her knees and with her arms open like a cross, she's looking up toward the imaginary window through which sunlight pours. There is terror and hope in her eyes, determination in the words she speaks into the ears of the air. Inside, there are words for which Eduardo Oligochea has a special predilection. The adjective implacable, for example, the syllables of the word delirium, pronounced one after another, which remind him of the artificial pearls of a necklace. He also likes the accent on the E in the adjective epiphrenic, the rounded sobriety of the word etiology. There are certain terms, on the other hand, that make him smile with an arrogance, a contemptuousness that is hard to conceal. The diagnosis of imbecility, masturbatory psychosis, fright, recent madness. Every time he finds one of them at the bottom of the interrogatory, he puts question marks in the margin. And after discarding them, he adds a new term with his fountain pen: drug addiction, hysteria, schizophrenia. These are the new names for those who have lost the desire to live. One of Dr. Oligochea's weakness is order. Both on his desk and in his head, things and words move to methodical rhythms. They follow patterns that are strict, though hallowed with harmony. Even when Eduardo Oligochea walks aimlessly through the city or inside the asylum, His steps give the impression that he knows exactly where he's going. The same can be said of his ideas. Inside Eduardo's mind, after a period of rapid development in the late 19th century, psychiatry went largely disregarded in among Mexican specialists until the late 1920s. They had been distracted by the war, the lack of water, peace, food, while the generals rehearsed new strategies for eliminating the enemy, and the victors tried out new allegories in their exercise of power. Madness was unnoticed as a beggar in the center of a burning city. Later, when the time came to think once again about the future of the country, about the education and formation of new citizens, the insane and the homeless returned without any difficulty whatever to classrooms and the chambers of political and intellectual discussion. The image of their distorted faces, the smell of their dirty clothes, and the abysmal conditions of their lives became the topic of pleasant conversation among lay people and specialists alike. The mere mention of the future of the city, the future of the country, cast over their blank imaginations the shadows of the sick and ragged. The danger these people represented to social order produced shivers of terror and pleasure simultaneously. The terror of being menaced and the pleasure of knowing that one was different from them. I thought you had left us, Don Joaquin. What have you been doing? The reserved, light tone of voice barely hides his sincere curiosity. There is a word someplace in the city, far from the asylum, that Eduardo knows nothing about, a private world that belongs only to Joaquin Buitrago. Confessions are never exhaustive, never completed. In the edifices of language, there are always unlighted corridors, unforeseen stairways, cellars hidden behind locked doors, whose keys slip through the hole in the pocket of the only owner, the sovereign king of meanings. But there, sitting with Joaquin once more before him, puzzled and in pain at the same time, Eduardo realizes for the first time that those secret places are not hidden, like bulky objects under a shawl, but rather exposed to the world, protected only by their transparency. Joaquin had not hidden anything from him, but Eduardo had not yet known how to see. Personal matters, Eduardo, nothing important. After hesitating for a few moments, the photographer decides to stand before his interlocutor. But now I'm back. Silence, immobility, personal matters. The two men are face to face, the unending noise of the mad enveloping them without touching them. Nothing important. Eduardo sinks into the world's space where the words are. He is drowning. He does not know what to say. He wants to know. He thinks he has the right to know. But while he gradually convinces himself that Joaquin will not say anything else, his puzzlement and confusion grow. He has the sense that he has been mocked. Who is this man now? Matilde is still telling the same old stories, he murmurs, almost offhandedly, searching for the tone he used in their former complicity. Joaquin looks at him, his eyes dull, and then, without replying, turns his eyes toward one corner of the room. He lights a cigarette. He looks at him again. A shadow of dislike crosses his face. Perhaps they are the only stories that you know how to hear, Eduardo. At 10 in the morning, inside the asylum, the photographer's words emerge in the air with the arrogance of bullets. The only thing I know how to hear? The question exits his heart through his arteries and returns with the flow from his veins. Despite his outward tranquility, parts of his body shiver uncontrollably and without pause. The emotions which until now he has managed to keep neatly in order on the shelves in his head begin to grow restless. The sound of a bottle breaking. He feels rage. He wants to hear an explanation. What are you talking about with Drago? Have you not read her file? Look, syphilitic ulcers, running sores, blisters on her lower lip, ether inhalations. And have you not noticed her logorrhea? That is her story, the only story, the true story, not some romantic theater, Joaquin. It's not that I don't know how to listen, it's that you are hearing voices that don't exist. The Wasserman test was negative. Of course, but all Matilda's symptoms indicate dementia, the logorrhea, the excitation and the nervous tics, the excessive and exaggerated mobility, the anomaly in her moral sense. Don't tell me that you think her stories are true. A woman like that working in the Fabregas Theater, in the Bonsai Opera? No, impossible. What are you talking about, Buitrago? Nothing, Eduardo, really. I'm not talking about anything. Before turning his back to him, still and indecisively, Joaquin adds, like all of them. The sound of his shoes on the tile floors is lost in the noises of the asylum. On his back, as stooped as that of an old man's, there is some invisible burden, a mythological animal that clings to his neck and whispers secrets in his ear. Eduardo watches him walk away like a man watching a ship on the high seas. Then, still motionless, from his lighthouse, he sees the outstretched hands of Matilda Burgos when she spies the billowing sails of Joaquin Buitrago. The meeting of the two figures make Eduardo shiver. Inside, in his cartilage and his organs, in the mass of heartbeats and fluids under his fingernails, in the roots of his hair, Eduardo feels a spasm of incredulity and irritation that always sends him back to the stability of books. A hand is a hand, a desk is a desk, an empty room is an empty room, but Eduardo is thinking about another place. And you, doctor, what do you think about love stories? What do you think about the future, doctor? And you, Eduardo, do you know what the limits of pain are? I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. That was wonderful. I have to say that the first time that I came across your work, it was I was walking through Brazos bookstore, and I saw your book, La Cresta de León, the Iliac Crest. Here, I'm going to show a copy, but I stopped, of course, because I said, how does one, write a book that is based on a piece of anatomy, and a novel that I would find that incorporates concepts of justice, the border, what it is to be a patient, and what it is to be a doctor, and I was very much intrigued by that, and then I read No One Will See Me Cry, and the passage you just read, everything is so seeped in the body, We have three bodies, three different characters. Matilda, who's this person at the insane asylum. Joaquin, who is a photographer, an artist who is addicted to morphine. And Eduardo, who is the psychiatrist at the insane asylum, and is overseeing the body of Matilda in many ways. from that passage you just read, you know, what Eduardo says at one point, the body is he makes it out that the body is the only story. And Joaquin at one point says, great catastrophes always take place in people's bodies. And so I was just curious, your thoughts on the connection between the body and story, you know, and how, and what draws you to those. But you talked about the research that went into this, but I'd love to hear how you connected to those bodies in the research, because it comes out in the prose.
Sure, wonderful question. Thank you, Ricardo. I would have to start by saying that I'm deeply convinced that writing is an embodied practice to begin with. Very often we tend to think that writing is something that we do with the imagination or with our minds. I disagree. I think that the writing involves every single cell of our bodies, and it is right there present in the very concrete material conditions of productions, right? That allow or don't allow, you know, the writing in and of itself. I do believe that writing is less the result of inspiration and of some metaphysical, immaterial inspiration, and more a product of work, right? I'm not talking about employment, I'm talking about labor, about our capacity to reproduce the world, to produce and reproduce the world in which we live, right? So all those considerations have made me painfully aware of what bodies do and how bodies behave in my stories, both in narrative and in poetry. I'm also very interested in the body of language as such, in the materiality of language. I was saying at the beginning that this is, I've never conceived of No One Will See Me Cry as a historical novel, even though very often is referred to as a historical novel. And I prefer to talk about it as a piece of documentary fiction, because the book is not only based on the information I was able to gather from the files, but very much works with very organically and directly with the actual language that was put into place by both doctors and patients and their families, right? So I wanted to bring into the scene of the book the actual words, how they were, if not pronounced, at least written and written about. And I think that contributes to the sense that we are not only listening to a story or getting to know a story, but rather experiencing a story. And I think that that would be my main aim when I'm writing. Even though I do pay attention to plot, I'm way more interested in using the tools of my trade, you know, from grammar to syntaxis, semiotic, whatever is available to me, in order to be able to construct with language an experience that we wouldn't have otherwise. If you put one layer on the other you know, over the other, and you could see that there is this growing sense that of both the materiality of my tools, the materiality of my own condition as a writer here, a Mexican writer living in the United States, speaking Spanish and writing in English, and all that comes into play as well, and the materiality then of my characters as well. I think that's when Joaquin Buitrago is expressing that idea that the main catastrophes are always taking place in bodies, is a call for that kind of attention to our daily lives, to the stuff that we are made of.
Well, one of the tools, when listening to you, it sprung in my mind. One of the tools that you utilize when you're writing is, it seems to be mystery. You know, you create in La Cresta del León, and also in this book, there's a sense of mystery central to the plot, but also central to the setting. You know, where exactly are we in La Cresta del León? You know, we're close to the border, but I was talking with a friend, and it almost seems like Gothic. It's so much mystery. And I, I was thinking about that, and how central to Matilda, she's sick. What's her life has been like. That's the central part. That's the central part of the structure of this book. But I'm just curious why you think mystery is so important, and also in the greater sense of writing. Because if you contrast that with the subject of science that comes up and medicine that comes up in the book, which is about precision and everything, there seems to be this opposite, which is this mystery that you evoke. Is mystery art, and why is it so important to put side by side with medicine and science?
I've been thinking a lot about that question, Ricardo, because I tend to agree with Argentinian author Ricardo Piglia, who's written wonderful essays about narrative and short stories specifically. I recommend his essays on the short story. For example, I use them quite a lot in my own creative writing classes. Well, one of the things that he claimed in these essays is that, speaking specifically about short stories, is that short stories are always telling two stories. One of them is obvious, and that's the one that we think we're reading, but there is always another one kind of lurking beneath all that. And there is there is then this secret that keeps the story in motion. The secret is not something that we can actually capture or control, and that's important. The secret, he says, is what shapes the form, what gives structure to the form of the story. And that in and of itself is very interesting. But I think another author, Eduardo Gruner, a professor and a philosopher, I believe, down in Argentina, had another description of the secret and writing that I very much love. He would say, and in his case, he's talking mostly about poetry, but I do think that this relates to all kinds of writing. He and I'm kind of, remembering here, I'm quoting from the top of my head. He spoke of poetry as a way that we humans have to share a secret without revealing it. And that's the most important part, that stories are not the place that we go to know what was, to find a final answer, right? The stories and I would say writing in general is a way that we have to share experiences among ourselves without the need of actually revealing every single aspect of it. Essentially, because I do, if the writers work with, we know a lot of things. I mean, we need to know, we have to have some control over the tools of our trade, as I mentioned before, but there are many uncertainties. There are many things that we do not know. And that in fact, the writing is a way of, if not knowing, at least to approaching that matter that so fascinated us. Although I think I should be speaking about myself. That's how I think I work in the stories. So I'm less concerned. I'm always trying to figure out why I'm coming back to these stories. Why is this so fascinating to me? Why am I going to be spending 4 or 5 years thinking about these things? And that keeps me going. But I'm less interested in getting to the one final answer. So I don't want to resolve the mystery. I want others to get to share that mystery as such, that secret as such. And I think that writing and perhaps art in general, that's it allows us to do that. On the other hand, we have science, we have medicine, we have this other field of knowledge that requires quite a different process, right? One of the things that fascinates me till this day about medicine, specifically about psychiatry, is the many attempts that psychiatrists have tried over the years through history to impose a certain order about the language with which we describe human behavior, especially the behavior of the mind, or the processes through which our minds work. And it seems to me, when I was reading these the medical files of the insane asylum, very often I was taken over by the sensation that I was witnessing a translation process. So here we had a poor man or woman from Mexico trying to convey the story of his or her life to a doctor who had to listen very intently, because remember, medical doctors had quite a huge suspicion about the medical standing, the scientific standing of psychiatry as such, especially during the early 20th century, although I'm not so sure the situation has changed that much. But in any case, doctors had to pay close attention to the patients, because they would allow them to increase their standing within the medical profession. So I'm not talking about doctors being inherently empathetic or concerned for their patients, although some of them were, but essentially that they had to pay that close of attention to this specific language. And it seems to me that semiotic situation, that exchange was so relevant for the diagnosis, for the medical diagnosis, and had very real material consequences on people's lives. So here we have, I had something that still fascinates me about the story, about these lives, something that I hope is at the heart of this novel, but that I cannot really touch or describe fully. And at the same time, a series of very complex, multi-layered exchanges between doctors and patients in a rather uneven situation, right, within asylum grounds, and yet communicating for very different purposes. So there is something of great relevance there at the medical level, but also the political level. Remember, the country and the city was changing radically. People were discussing what normalcy was, what the ideal citizen would be like. And the bodies and ailments of people deemed as mentally unstable played a major role in those definitions.
I mean, I think one of the things that going along what you just said, I think one of the things that really stuck with me, that an extra layer you add to the art, is this political world of where these take place. These are, you know, you set Nadie Me Verá Llorar in 1910, 1920s, 1930s, Mexico City, Veracruz. And it is a very interesting time period politically, because actually there are Porfirio Diaz's, you know, most trusted advisors are doctors, científicos.
Yes.
Which is something that our society is actually weighing right now, right? We're in the midst of a pandemic, and how the medical community actually speaks with politicians, and that communication is essential right now, or at least it's deemed essential now. So, and there's another side that resists that. So you explore this tension between like how medicine can become political. You know, you explore that tension in your books. Why do you use the art of fiction to do that? You're a scholar, and I'm just curious, like, because that's the added layer. I like to hear like why the art of fiction does that, and why is it also important to explore this tension between how medicine can become political like that.
Yeah, that's also very interesting. Look, I was, as I said earlier, when I started reading these files, I was mostly thinking about a dissertation that I had to write. But then the writing of dissertations respond to specific academic protocols. There are certain things that I needed to mention, and there were many that were superfluous for a dissertation book, right? So I had and take into consideration that before becoming a historian, I was a writer. I've been a writer before everything else in my life. So I had written only a book before this one. I had published a book of short stories before this one. And I've been essentially thinking mostly about how to write in many forms, academically, but in some other forms as well. So I had plenty of information for my dissertation. In fact, I think I had too much. And there were issues that truly did not belong there. The smells, in description of smells in specific rooms, the characteristics of the chestnut trees, the quality of light, the number of commodities in Mexican markets, the kind of diets that middle-class people were getting used to. In Veracruz, that you mentioned earlier, folk fiestas, right? The process of dispossession of land, the smell of vanilla. So there were plenty of all these very concrete sensory detail, we're prone to say in our workshops, that my advisors in the dissertation committee couldn't care less about. Truly. And so I was left after I completed the dissertation. I was left with this plethora of not only of details, but of lives and emotions and scenes. And I knew from the beginning that I was going to write something else, that some of that was going to go to the dissertation, but I knew that my interest went well beyond the dissertation. So I think I was writing both at the same time, the novel and the dissertation. I finished the novel first, I think. And then my dissertation, is that right? Yeah. No, just the opposite. I finished the dissertation first and then the novel, which makes sense, right? And so many of the questions I had that came to mind when I was writing the more history oriented book, I was able to tackle in the novel. So fiction helped me to fill the gaps, to create scenes, to make many of these scenes palpable. I created, so to speak, rooms that people could live in. It became an inhabitable process. That's how I think books function. These are rooms that we open doors into and we lived in for a while. If lucky, these books and these rooms and these lives will end up changing ours radically. And that's one of my that's something that I keep in mind as I work in these books. So politics are never away from what we write. I think that if I'm handling language, if I'm working with language as something that doesn't belong to me, something that belongs to entire community of practitioners, of speakers, then from the beginning, this is a political process. This is a political practice. So language allows some stories to be told in certain ways and prevents others from being told as well. So we live in a society that favors some languages over others, right? And I'm not talking only about favoring English over Spanish. I'm also talking about favoring abstract language over more concrete oriented language, right? Favoring very concise language instead of these carnal description of things, right? So when we are trying to tell stories from the fringes of society, like in my case, in this case, I needed to question, to begin with, the language that I was using, the hegemonic dominant language. And so I needed to subvert that language, to create, so to speak, little windows into that language so that we could look into a different kind of world. I needed to open cracks in that language so that that we could face in its entirety the complex lives of these poor men and women from early 20th century Mexico. And other thing that I think is very important too is that we live in a society that is usually very afraid of time passing, essentially because we're afraid of death, right? And it's very easy for us to live under the illusion that the past is somewhere back there, all done and organized, right? Forgotten in many cases. And in this book and in all the books that I've written, I am working with the opposite idea. I think the past is always with us. As Milorad Tadic, a writer that I like very much, used to say, the past is always about to happen. And I think these books open up that possibility to make us aware that the present is but the tip of the iceberg, that we are in fact very close to layers of experience, to layers of knowledge that are not somewhere buried in the past, but very much here with us. And bringing that to mind, I think, is a task that helps critical thinking. And critical thinking cannot exist outside of politics as such.
Well, I want to get to the questions, but you seem to have, like, you answered one of my questions right there, which was, I was going to ask you if your master was the scholarship or the writing, and it sounds like it's the writing, but it also sounds like it's the connection with the people that like from the 1920s that you wanted to connect with them, and they, you know, it had to be through literature, and that the history really served that literature of that connection. A lot of it. I hope I'm not misphrasing that, you know.
No. I think it's true. I've been, and I consider myself a writer first, and I think scholarship is another form of writing. So creative writing, it has its own methods, its own more, so to speak. And academic writing is a writing with a heavy protocol, but it's writing too, and it could be very interesting too. It could be very creative as well, depending on who the writer is, right? And about the other aspect that you mentioned, you know, the first time that I came across the file of the character that I ended up being Matilda Burgos, I was struck by the sensation that file, that the letters that she had written for that file were somehow written for eternity, right? And that I was there interrupting that trajectory. And it seemed to me that at that point I acquired a debt with Matilda Burgos. So I got a glimpse of her story, and I was so enamored, so fascinated by that story, by the importance of that story. And that, as I said earlier, look at me, I'm still all these years after that first encounter, talking about how relevant it was for me first to look at the picture. To that grimace of hers, to that mischievousness in her face, something that I did not associate readily with a mentally unstable or mentally ill person. And then I was taken by her cleverness, how brilliant she was. It was obvious to me by looking at her handwriting that was something that she had just learned how to do. And it was not an expert at it. But at the same time, she was very clear about what she wanted to say, what she wanted to convey. And so she opened up a whole view of that world. And for me, the ethical question was, how could I tell this story? I am a woman in the late 20th century, you know, with the privilege of working in an academic field. How could I tell the story of a poor woman deemed to be mentally unstable in early 20th century Mexico? And the only answer that I the only valid answer that I ended up giving to myself was that I had to pay a lot of attention, that I had to do things with great care, that I had to do a lot of research, and that I had to be exhaustive. And in that sense, all the training as a historian was extremely useful. I was not, and I will never be Matilda Burgos, but I can get close enough. I can open up a small, slippery at times road so that we can perhaps see the world through her eyes, at least for a couple of hours.
Oh, that's beautiful. We have a question from the audience that I'd like to read out to you. It's yes. From Margarita Bernal, and it says, Cristina, he disfrutado inmensamente tus libros. En tus palabras señales la relación entre el cuerpo, el espacio y lo que escribes. Y además las relaciones político-académicas del gremio médico y el mundo en que la novela se desarrolla. Matilde y Buitrago son anhistóricos. En su amor, es su amor lo que los aísla. Es un síntoma de su condición mental. I thought that was so interesting because I was actually, when she said anhistóricos, I was actually thinking that they're like the anti-Forrest Gumps sometimes. They're the exact opposite of Forrest Gump in many ways, that these events are happening, but they are in the hospital, but yet they are so impacted by, they are a symbol of so much. So anyway, I didn't mean to, this is a beautiful question by Margarita.
Yes, Margarita, muchas gracias por preguntarla. Y puesto que la preguntaste en español, te contesto en español. Ricardo tiene razón, estos personajes parecen estar aislados dentro del hospital, pero uno de los argumentos o de las líneas narrativas de la novela, y creo que va precisamente a eso, a decir que aunque parece que está aislado, el manicomio en realidad está cruzado por muchas relaciones con la ciudad, con el régimen, con el país en general, ¿no? Entonces, a mí me interesaba enfatizar el mundo que ellos dos se hacen, el mundo de una historia de amor un poco extraña, pero también la manera en cómo todo lo que está pasando dentro del hospital y fuera del hospital los acaba afectando un montón, ¿no? De hecho, los acaba hiriendo profundamente. Tanto Matilda como Joaquín son personajes heridos, creo yo, por el proceso de modernización en México que está iniciando en esa época con gran vigor, y por sus propios demonios internos, ¿no? Que no son menores en la historia.
For those of you who don't speak Spanish, she said that they're the anti-Forrest Gumps. No, I'm just joking. I'm just joking around. Let's see. I think we have another question from before. Kirsten, would you like to read that one?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. We have some questions that were posted when some of the audience members registered for this event. And but before I get to that, I can't resist commenting on something you said about what you left out of your dissertation, or the sort of extra stuff, the smells and the senses. You were actually just ahead of your time, because now this field of the history of the senses is completely exploding. And if you had actually just handed that in as your dissertation, you know, decades later, people would be saying, oh my goodness, look at this, the first dissertation in the history of the senses. So anyway, but I think that's wonderful, because it's a real tension in that field, how to kind of excavate those forms of information or evidence that really are usually conveyed in ways that seem like they're outside of the historical norms for that kind of narrative. So I loved that you commented on that. I wanted to ask a question, though, that someone asked. They asked, what is the relationship between putting difficult life events into narrative and healing?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a powerful question. I You know, most of the books that I've written, especially this one, No One Will See Me Cry, and the most recent one that I published in Spanish, El Invencible Verano de Liliana, deal with trauma. In this case, is the larger national trauma of the Mexican Revolution and the challenge of modernization processes. And in my most recent book is the trauma of losing my sister to femicide in the 1990s as well. So much could be said about the fact that putting this into writing, creating a language able to convey the story behind this trauma might be, if not the healing process as such, the beginning of one, that's for sure. I've said very often recently, especially in regards to my most recent book, that healing will never be achieved without justice. That is not something that can be done only in the realm of writing, that it needs to go through the halls of justice. Justice has to be served. So I think if we want to think about healing in those terms, we would need to go outside of the book and directly into the community, the world in which the wound, the trauma was created, and therefore the need to work very closely with this kind of language. Having said that, though, I really believe, I was saying earlier in trying to answer a question posed by Ricardo, that we live in societies that favor certain kinds of languages, and these languages favor certain storytelling. Mm-hmm. And just opening up spaces to tell non-normative stories, I think is incredibly important, because usually these non-normative stories, the stories of Mexican Americans in the United States, for example, the stories that have to deal with migration, with the border, for example, stories about how our bodies are handled in the public health systems, all these kinds of things are not the language that the dominant language is not readily available right there to tell these stories in as much depth and with as much empathy as they need to. And so my work, I think, as a writer, is to do that research, to handle language, to work with language in such a way that those stories can emerge and can be shared at the deepest of levels, perhaps not necessarily at the level of the resolution of the story, at the level of the unveiling of the mystery, but indeed at the other level, at the level in which we communicate with what is very often unspeakable, right? Mm-hmm. Which goes beyond our own capacity of naming. And once we get at that point, I think we are into very serious territory into what art does too.
Thank you. That's a topic that we address often in the medical humanities classes that we teach, right? When we think about literature and art and how what its place is in medicine and public health and healing more broadly. We are almost out of time, but I would like to ask you one more question from the pre-registration, which you've kind of touched on this a little bit throughout the talk, but a couple of different questions. Wanted to hear about your transnational approach and how that kind of if you think that allows you to take a certain kind of stance in relation to thinking about medicine from a more humanistic point of view, or what impact you see that as having on the, not just the kind of writing you do, but the stories you tell.
Yeah, I was born on the Mexican side of the US border, and by now I've spent more years in the United States than in Mexico, which is very interesting. I've written, in fact, all my creative writing books, I've written those from within the United States in Spanish. Mm-hmm. So my Spanish has been at work here in an English-speaking context, and I think that's not a minor detail. That is being marking and making the stories that I write. I'm very interested, as you can glean from what I've been saying, in stories that are not usually told, the stories that come to contradict and to pose questions about mainstream understandings of society. And I think the language of medicine, especially the semiotic encounter that Arthur Kleinman claims that diagnoses are, I think allow us to get into the heart of that exchange. So we are seeing there how people that we tend to think are in the position of power are not necessarily so, right? And people who a situation of powerlessness is not necessarily so as well. So I think it's very important to me to get at the intimate operation that comes into play once we have to deal with what happens to our bodies. It's always very it's always surprising to me that we use a language that likes to think of itself as very objective and public to describe the most intimate aspects of our existence. And whatever happens, to my fingernail or to my stomach or to my lung, it has to be described with a language that is being so normative in other places. So that contrast, I think, is something that fascinates me because it is uneven, because it is full of dissent, because it is conflicting, and because essentially it will provide us an alternative way of looking at how things are, have been, and might become in the future.
Thank you. It's wonderful. You can see when you read your work that there are terms from medicine and science everywhere, all over the place, right? Like they come in, but then you transform them in this way that I think is very kind of destabilizing, which I think is exactly the kind of work that we need, and that the more that we can bring that into a kind of awareness within medicine, like it can bring a real self-awareness for those who use those terms, that I think can be very powerful. So I want to thank you for that and for your work, because we're sharing it with our students and our communities who are in medicine or planning to be in medicine. And I think it opens a new perspective that is really essential and so valuable. So I want to thank you for that again. And I want to thank Ricardo for the wonderful dialogue that the two of you had. It was such a pleasure to listen and be a part of this. And I want to thank all of the audience members. I know we didn't get to all of your questions. Thank you for participating and being here. Thank you again for the wonderful reading and for the discussion. And with that, I will say good night.